everyone, so today we'll be talking about the integumentary system, the lymphatic system, and the autonomic systems, and how they play a role to keep us alive. So let's start off with our skin, which is part of the integumentary system, along with our nails, our hair, and exocrine glands. But mainly our main focus is to speak about the skin today. So our skin protects from harmful pathogens. It regulates our body temperature and it synthesizes products and aids in immune defense. So our cutaneous membrane consists of 3 layers of skin, starting with the most superficial, the epidermis, followed by the dermis, and then the hypodermis, which is also known as the subcutaneous layer. So now let's talk about the cell types that are present in the epidermis. So we have 4 cell types, which include the keratinocytes, the melanocytes, the Merkel cells, as well as the Langerhans cells. So a hint or a mnemonic that I like to use to remember the 4 types include koalas make me love. Now let's look at the Venn diagram here. We have thick and thin skin, which can be compared and contrasted. So both the thick and thin skin comprise of the epidermis. However, the thick skin has 5 layers of the skin, and the thin skin has 4 layers. So the thick skin has the stratum lucidum, which the thin skin doesn't. Thick skin is also found on the hands and soles of the feet, whereas the thin skin is found on the rest of the body. Now let's look at the epidermis. So the epidermis consists of the 5 layers, starting with the stratum basale, which is the most deepest, followed by stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and then finally stratum corneum, which is the most superficial. So the basal layer. So the basal layer consists of cytokeratin and cells called keratinocytes. So let's break this down. Cytes means cell, and keratino kind of sounds like keratin. Did you know that a rhino's horn is made up of keratin, which is the same material as your hair and fingernails? So these cells, the keratinocytes, produce a tough protein, which gives our skin this tough outer layer. So using that association, rhino's horn with keratin is important because similar to a rhino's horn, keratin also provides this tough outer layer. The basal layer is also responsible for rapid cell division, and this is where it occurs. And this makes sense because it's the deepest layer. It provides most of the cell division in that place to occur so that the cells can move upwards and push upwards to the other layers. Melanocytes are also found in this layer. So melanocytes produce melanin, which is a pigment responsible for skin color. After the basal layer, we have the stratum spinosum. So the stratum spinosum consists of keratinocytes and desmosomes, but the keratinocytes are squished closer by the desmosomes. So now you may be asking, why do we call this layer this name, stratum spinosum? Well, when we see this layer of skin under microscopes, especially when it's dehydrated, we can see that it resembles shriveled and spiny. And so that's why we call it spinosum. And that's where the term originates from. This layer also contains our immune system cells, which are the Langerhans cells, which look for any pathogens that are looking to infect our skin and they destroy them. Next, we have the stratum granulosum. So this layer contains granules, hence granulosum. More specifically, keratohyalin granules, which hold and produce proteins that handle the keratin, along with the production of keratin by the keratinocytes. Another important function of this layer of skin is that it produces lamellar bodies. So these lamellar bodies actually help form the lipid layer that sits on top of our skin. So think about lipids, means fat, right? Fat and oil, for example, and water. So water and fat really don't go together. And so that's why we get this watertight capability for our skin. And this is very important because it prevents most pathogens from going deep into our skin and reaching the bloodstream. Above the granulosum, we have the stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum contains dead keratinocytes. So lucid, one way to remember is lucid means bright, and dead kind of means like the dead keratinocytes have reached the bright light. Another way to remember is that the previous layer, the granulosum, has worked pretty hard producing the keratin, producing the keratohyalin granules, the lamellar bodies, that by doing so, they worked so hard that they died. And so the stratum lucidum is kind of seen as this clear, glossy layer because the cells have no nuclei or organelles present in them. And again, reminder that this layer is only seen in thick skin, particularly in the hands and soles of the feet. And lastly, the stratum corneum, our most superficial layer. So corneum kind of sounds like the cornea, which is one of the superficial parts of the eye. So similar to skin, this layer is also the most superficial. So that's one way to think about it. The layer also has dead keratinocytes, which are stacked in layers. And so this is where exfoliation comes from. So whenever you exfoliate, you're actually removing the dead keratinocytes from this layer. Now let's move on to the dermis. So the dermis consists of two layers, the papillary layer as well as the reticular layer. So the papillary layer nourishes and supports the epidermis. It is consisting of loose tissues as well as it contains the dermal papillae, the capillaries, and the nerve axons. A key compare and contrast is that the dermis contains blood vessels that supply the blood, which allows it to nourish the epidermis. But the epidermis does not contain the blood vessels. So as you can see in the Venn diagram over there, we have that compare and contrast present. Another important key detail is that the dermis and the epidermis both contain sensory receptors. This includes touch, temperature, pain, and pressure. But the dermis contains the vibration receptor, which the epidermis does not. Next, the reticular layer contains interwoven, irregular, dense connective tissue, collagen, hair follicles, sweat, and sebaceous glands. Functions of the reticular layer include attaching the skin to deeper tissues and storing lipid reserves. This makes sense because the reticular layer is quite deep. It also includes sensory receptors that we just talked about, particularly the vibration. The dermis is also associated with wrinkles, and so wrinkles occur because of the fibers in the reticular layer are very used to stretching and then recoiling. But with age, with stress, with telomeres getting shorter, and UV light, these fibers don't really recoil as much, leaving these fine lines. Lines of cleavage are also apparent in the reticular layer, and these are disrupted when wounds occur because the wounds are often perpendicular to the lines of cleavage, which then, during healing, can form scar tissue. Now we have the subcutaneous layer, the last layer, and this layer stabilizes the integument, and it's consisting of adipose tissue as well as major blood vessels. So I like to think about the subcutaneous layer as soil, which has the most nutrients because it's in the deepest part of the earth. And so this provides the energy for a plant to grow. And similarly, the subcutaneous layer contains these blood vessels, which are analogous to soil, which supply the blood to the dermis, particularly the reticular layer and the papillary layer, which nourishes the epidermis, which is kind of similar to sprout growing. Now let's look at some accessory structures. So we have hair, which is part of the integumentary system as well, which is made of keratin. Hair follicles hold the hair like a basket. Functions of hair include insulation, protection from UV light, it prevents debris from entering our body, especially the nose and the ear hairs, and the contraction of the erector pili muscles, which are responsible for goosebumps. So we'll come back to erector pili muscles when we visit the sympathetic nervous system. The accessory structure also, so the integumentary system also includes exocrine glands. So these contain sebaceous glands, which produce sebum to nourish the hair. Sweat glands produce amerecrine secretion to cool our bodies off, especially on a very hot day. And mammary glands, they produce milk and pheromones as well, so that the baby can recognize its mother. Now, there's problems with the skin as well. Sometimes a furnicle can happen, and that's when it's an infection to the hair follicle because of bacteria, which then enter deep into the epidermis. This can lead to a variety of conditions, including vasculitis, septicemia, and cellulitis. Septicemia being the most severe. Vasculitis refers to the infection of the blood vessels. Septicemia is the infection of the blood. So this is kind of dangerous because once the bacteria reaches the bloodstream, it can circulate towards the kidneys and the liver, which purify the blood. And if they do, then the kidneys and the liver are then infected with the bacteria. And then cellulitis, which is the inflammation of the skin. And again, it's mainly caused by bacteria, and some symptoms include redness, swelling, and pus, as you can see in the picture there, and treatments are antibiotics. Now let's move on to the lymphatic system. So whenever an infection occurs, we have phagocytes to help fight off infection. These include the monocytes, the eosinophils, and the neutrophils. The main functions for the lymphatic system is that it maintains the blood volume, it aids in immune defense, it maintains the chemical composition of the interstitial fluid, and provides transport for nutrients, hormones, and waste throughout the body. Now, imagine an infection. Whether that's a bacteria or viral infection, our lymphatic system gets activated and produces a response. And these are due to lymphocytes, which are the primary cells of the lymphatic system. They fight bacteria and viruses, cancer, and other toxins. The types of lymphocytes that are present in the human body are the T cells, which are thymus dependent, the B cells, which refer to bone marrow derived, and the NK cells, which are natural killer cells. It's important to note that there are 4 types of T cells: cytotoxic, which produce toxins to kill the invader; helper T cells, which coordinate the immune response and activate the B cells to produce antibodies. We have the suppressor T cells, which suppress the immune system, especially after prolonged activation, because it's important to suppress it as it can result in more damage to the immune system. And memory T cells, which kind of create a mind map of the antigen and store it stored in the body, so that next time the antigen is exposed, the immune system is ready to attack. So a mnemonic that I use to help me remember the 4 types, cytotoxic, helper, suppressor, and memory, is CATS help strengthen memories. It's also important to note that there are 2 pathways for immunity. One is the cell-mediated, so it's a direct cell-to-cell attack, and the next one is antibody-mediated. Cell-mediated pathways always start first, and they trigger the start of the antibody-mediated pathway, which we'll look in the further slides. So before we get started with that, where do lymphocytes come from? So that's important to understand. Well, the production of lymphocytes starts in the pluripotential stem cell. So here I've created a flowchart to clearly describe what happens in each stage. So the pluripotential stem cell forms 2 sets of lymphoid stem cells. One of the sets goes to the thymus, and with the interaction of thymosin, it becomes immunocompetent and differentiates into T cells, which are there aiding for cell-mediated immunity. The other set stays in the bone marrow, and can differentiate to either B cells or NK cells. B cells, again, they are in the antibody-mediated immunity response, and the NK cells, which provide immunological surveillance. So they're kind of like the cameras of the immune system where they're watching for any pathogens. And if they find some, they'll destroy them. Now, how does our immune system work? Well, whenever we have a foreign invader or an antigen entering the body, we'll have macrophages, which will phagocytize. So that key word, phagocytize, literally means to engulf, to eat. And so they're going to engulf the antigen or invader, and they're going to present it to specific T cells. These T cells will then rapidly divide to form more cytotoxic helper and memory T cells. Again, the helper T cells will then cause and coordinate the immune system response, and the B cells will produce antibodies. The antigen and antibody complex will attract leukocytes, and the leukocytes will kill the invader. Note that helper T cells coordinate the cell-mediated immunity with antibody-mediated immunity as well. Now, let's talk about fluids. So, we have a lot of fluids in the human body, and depending on the context, the fluids present can be called different things. So let me give an example. Plasma, right? So blood, fluid in the blood is known as plasma. Fluid in the interstitial compartment is known as interstitial fluid. And fluid in the lymphatic vessels is known as lymph. So lymph consists of small proteins, water, and the interstitial fluid. Now, let's talk about the role of blood pressure. How does lymph really enter the lymphatic capillaries? Well, that's due to blood pressure, which forces the solutes out and the waste outs of the plasma and into the interstitial compartment, and then enters the lymphatic system. So there's two types of lymphatic vessels that we need to kind of identify first. The lymphatic vessels that are small are referred to as lymphatic capillaries, and the vessels that are big are referred to as lymphatic ducts. So both of them combine to form superficial lymphatic vessels and deep lymphatic vessels. So superficial lymphatic vessels are found in the mucous lining of the digestive, the respiratory, the urinary, and reproductive tracts, and also the subcutaneous layer. The deep lymphatic vessels collect lymph from skeletal tissues of the neck, the limbs, and trunks. The lymph then drains into 5 lymphatic trunks. These are the jugular, the bronchomediastinal, the subclavian, the intestinal, and the lumbar. So again, another hint that I like to use is Jonas Brothers Sing in Louisiana. After the trunks, the lymph drains into the lymphatic duct and then drains into the subclavian veins. So here's another picture that really outlines, a great picture that really outlines what's going on in our lymphatic system. So when examining this image, some of the key messages include that the right lymphatic duct connects with the right subclavian vein. The left thoracic duct connects with the left subclavian vein. The thoracic duct also receives lymph from the lower part of the body because it's inferior to the diaphragm, and it drains the lymph as well from the left side of the body, including the left arm, the left side of the neck, torso, into this left subclavian vein. The left thoracic duct also consists of cisterna chyli, as you can see right here, and it collects the lymph from the left and right lumbar trunks, intestinal trunks, left subclavian trunk, left bronchomediastinal trunk, and left jugular trunk. The right lymphatic duct drains lymph from the right side of the body, including the right arm, right side of the neck, right side of the torso, into the right subclavian vein. It collects the lymph from the right subclavian trunk, right jugular trunk, right bronchomediastinal trunk as well. So overall, to sum up, the thoracic duct kind of does most of the work in terms of drainage. Now we have the lymphoid organs. These include the spleen, the thymus gland, and the lymph nodes. So the spleen is the largest lymphoid organ, and it consists of the diaphragmatic surface as well as the visceral surface, where vessels enter and leave. The spleen also contains the capsule and the white and red pulp. So the red pulp's function, for example, is that it stores platelets. And so whenever we experience, or whenever a person experiences extreme trauma where there's a lot of blood loss, the platelets are released so that clot formations can happen, so that we don't bleed, or that person does not bleed to death. The thymus gland is also another important organ, and it consists of the cortex and medulla. The cortex produces the T cells which migrate to the medulla, and the medulla has those T cells remaining inactive until they enter circulation. The medulla also contains thymic corpuscles, of which we don't really know the function of. Next, we have the lymph nodes, right? So one of the bigger kind of organs that are present in the lymphatic system, like more of them. And so they exist where the body is more prone to infection and injury. So we have lymph nodes in the axillary, for example. We have cervical lymph nodes, abdominal, popliteal lymph nodes. They also clean up the lymph so that it's returned to the blood as soon as possible. So again, these lymph nodes again contained in the cervical, axillary, breast, abdominal region, and inguinal region. And so an autonomic that I came up with is curly anacondas bite and break intestines. Note that the deep inguinal lymph nodes connect with the deep lymphatic vessels, and the superficial inguinal lymph nodes connect with the superficial lymphatic vessels. Now let's move on to the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system consists of the efferent neurons, the smooth muscle, and the cardiac muscle. It's also subdivided into two parts: the sympathetic nervous system, which initiates the flight or fight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which initiates the rest and digestion response. Now, the SNS has three pathways, but these three pathways have the main goal of delivering oxygen and blood to the skeletal muscles and the skeletal system. So activation results in increased metabolism, alertness, and the synapses are close to the spinal cord. So in the SNS, all preganglionic nerve fibers release acetylcholine. Most postganglionic nerve fibers release norepinephrine, and these have stimulatory effects. So one of the pathways, so see how there were three pathways? One of the pathways are the sympathetic chain ganglia. So their target organs include organs inside the thoracic cavity, and spinal nerves, which are created from the ventral root and the dorsal root, combine to form that spinal nerve. So examples of the sympathetic chain ganglia include the cervical, the coccygeal, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. So above the sympathetic chain ganglia, the spinal nerve passes through the intervertebral foramen, and the white ramus branches off the spinal nerve. The nerve then goes to a nearby sympathetic chain ganglion. It is important to note that all of our nerve fibers carry sympathetic nerve fibers, which supply skeletal muscles and dermatomes. And each spinal nerve has both pre- and postganglionic nerve fibers. So again, these examples with phenonomic: can crazy ticks look scary? So functions of the sympathetic chain ganglia include increased skeletal muscle activity, dilation of the pupils, bronchodilation of the lungs, increasing your heart rate, and stimulation of the erector pili muscles. So think about a bear. So pretend you're camping, for example, and you see a mama bear with cubs, and you guys make eye contact. Uh-oh, right? So naturally, your sympathetic nervous system gets activated. And all of these things that happen to your body either want to make you fight the bear or run away from it. Most chances, you're going to run away. This is why your skeletal muscle gets a lot of blood pumped into it. You have dilation of pupils because you want to scan your environment to see the threat. You want light to be in so that you can see what's going on. Bronchodilation, so you're going to start heavy breathing, right? So your lungs will dilate in order to get that extra oxygen into your system so that oxygen supply increases. This also increases your heart rate, so your heart starts pumping really quickly. And then stimulation of rector pili muscles is kind of an evolution response where these will cause goosebumps. So the hair will kind of stand up to kind of make yourself look bigger and scarier to the threat. Now, here are some of the preganglionic nerve fibers, which have been broken down into particular nerves, and then these ganglions, as well as the organs that they supply to. And next, we have the collateral ganglia. So these neurons innervate the effectors in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So decrease the activity of digestive organs, reduces blood flow to the visceral organs, mobilization of energy reserves, so converting that glycogen to glucose conversion by liver. And then we have the suprarenal medulla. So the suprarenal medulla is important to note because there's no synapse on the pathway that goes to the suprarenal medulla. And this is because of conserving time. Fibers just simply pass through the sympathetic chain and cilia ganglion without synapsing and reach the suprarenal medulla. Then fibers synapse on the neurons, which release the neurotransmitters epinephrine and norepinephrine to produce that long-lasting response. So the neurotransmitters that I just talked about, epinephrine, norepinephrine, they kind of act like hormones, and they circulate throughout the body. And they produce a longer lasting response because of that, compared to the last two activation pathways. It increases the alertness by the activation of the reticular system. Cardiovascular activity increases, so does respiratory, and muscle tone increases as well. So think about that bear and you're running away. Think about the systems that would be activated. Next, we have the parasympathetic system, nervous system, which is kind of like the rest and digestive response. So we have the preganglionic nerve fibers, which release acetylcholine, and the effects are stimulatory. We have postganglionic nerve fibers, which release acetylcholine, and effects are inhibitory. Synapses are also very close to the target organ and sometimes even within the target organ. Preganglionic neurons are found in the brain stem, and there's less divergence compared to this SNS. So I will compare and contrast that in the future. So let's move on to the cranial nerves, which control a majority of the parasympathetic nervous system. So cranial nerve number 3 controls the intrinsic muscles. Number 7 is responsible for producing tears and saliva as it's associated with the salivary and tear glands. Nerve 9 promotes digestion, so it's associated with the parotid glands. And number 10, which is, I think, the most important, the vagus nerve, supplies the thorax and abdomen and does most of the work. Note that for the pelvis, the parasympathetic supply comes from the pelvic splanchnic nerve S2 to S4. So here is a diagram of the cranial nerves. See how it's more localized compared to the sympathetic nervous system right over here, which is kind of more complicated. So that's important contrast to make as well. And here are the cranial nerves separated so that you can see exactly which ganglion controls which organ. Now, I've created these diagrams, Venn diagrams particularly, to compare and contrast preganglionic fibers, and postganglionic fibers. So preganglionic fibers are short, extend from the spinal cord to the sympathetic chain. Post are long and extend from the spinal cord to the body organs. Note that both of them are found in the spinal nerve. So here's a summary of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So we've already discussed about the sympathetic, but the parasympathetic is kind of like the opposite. So decreased heart rate, constriction of pupils, blood supply to smooth muscles. So key point, smooth muscles. In sympathetic, it was skeletal. In parasympathetic, it's smooth. Sexual arousal, constriction of the respiratory passages as well. And lastly, we have plexuses. So plexuses occur when the parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers mix and combine to form these plexuses. So we have the cardiac, the pulmonary, the esophageal, the celiac, and the hypogastric plexus, and the inferior mesenteric plexus. So an autonomic that I like to use is Carla pushes, Evan cries, hides inside. So I hope you learned a little bit more about the three systems and how they're interconnected to keep us alive. I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.